there's certain ideas that, although they might be based solidly on, let's say, rigorous Talmudic logic, sometimes they might have a fatal flaw, and sometimes they are not. They're not tenable because of their absurd and radical conclusions that they may lead to. They sort of paint us into a corner. I dubbed this phenomenon a few years ago. What was it? I called it paint yourself into a corner Judaism. And unfortunately, we keep doing that to ourselves. We lock ourselves into halachic ideas, and then we can't break out of them. We just can't get out of that. And we have to actually learn how to get out of that, because it's critical for us. We, as a Jewish nation, have to start living once again as Jews. We have to rebuild the temple. We have to create a Jewish society here in the land of Israel. We cannot do otherwise. We have to prepare for these things. And a prime example I used to say is as I thought this was the best example, was the resistance in, let's say, the early 20th century of the Jewish people to leave the exile, especially in Europe. They were basically going to get themselves killed. And like Rav Schechter says, that was a mistake. They should have picked up and left. They had the chance. And for many people, it just wasn't an idea. Most people were disconnected to moving back to the land of Israel. That wasn't part of their Judaism. But there's some people who are conscious of it. There's some people who are religious and have at least this concept, and they know that that is a Jewish ideal. So they should have done so. But the problem is that for many of the people who were Jewish and idealistic and wanted to keep the Torah, they were prevented by their a mindset, which is actually a very halachic one, that there might have been a Talmudic / biblical imperative keeping them away from the land of Israel. And while it could be argued, I think that it's a good argument. The whole thing about the 3 oaths that the Jewish people took not to rise up as a wall and go back to the land of Israel saved a lot of Jewish lives back in the day when it was used as a cover for, let's say, when the Jewish people needed to avoid the attention of whatever Gentile overlords at the time. They could show the Kaiser or the Ottoman Sultan, yes, we have no intentions to overthrow their rule in the land of Israel. We have no intentions to do any upset the status quo. Look, it says so in the Talmud. As a matter of religious principle, we do not wish to do such a thing. And that saved them a lot of times, because if they didn't show them such a thing, they might have endangered their lives. So that was a good thing. But then when the time came to actually practice such a thing, it hurt them. It was something that was actually quite dangerous. It prevented them from saving their own lives. So we have to know what ideas actually work and what ideas don't. Along these lines, I would like to lump anything that has to do with advancing keeping the Torah in its fullest form. There are commandments that we have to keep. If someone goes and tells you, let's work on rebuilding the temple, and there's someone else who says, no, we shouldn't do that, now's not the time, you know, based on this principle, that the one who says, let's not, is wrong, because he's taking a position that is pushing us farther away from our goal. He's taking a position that could potentially get people killed in the long run. He's taking a position that could lead to further exile. This is something that I learned from the Mutti Berger, certainly not a religious Zionist by any stretch, who questioned, how do we know this is it? If we don't live up to what we're supposed to do, we could suffer through another round of destruction, exile, etc. Although Rav Herzog would disagree, Rabbi Berger does have history on his side. And not everybody possessed that Masorah that Rav Herzog had. They're not quite certain that this is it. And I would think that if we believe in the Torah, we also have to know that everything is contingent. We can't just lean back and say, okay, we've now made it to the redemption, and now it's just a matter of time. We just have to sit back, and no more effort is required of us. On the contrary, we can really mess this up, and then God knows they'll talk about the third Commonwealth in history books while they're still waiting a fourth Commonwealth. God forbid such a thing should happen. But we always have to think about that. That is a historical, a practical possibility if we mess this up. On that note, I'd like to get to this idea. The first one, we have to go back in time to Shabbos Zachor, when we read about Parashat Zachor. And there we have the commandment to remember Amalek and wipe him out, erase his memory, and also the commandment to remember. And I was discussing a few years ago the idea that the reading of Zachor is a biblical commandment. Or some say it's a biblical, or at least a biblical obligation. Everybody agrees that Zachor is a biblical commandment. It's an idea that's brought in Shulchan Aruch that one fulfills a biblical obligation by attending and hearing the reading of Zachor in the synagogue the week before Purim, or at least maybe even just the day, as long as it's the Shabbat before Purim. That is what a lot of people are aware of, and a whole slew of stringencies have developed culturally because of this premise. So the first one is that we have to know, it doesn't say, for example, in the Mishnah Torah, that is the case. So where does this idea come from? Where would it be? And this, by the way, the assumption is that all the other Torah readings of the year are just rabbinical obligations. There's no commandment, for example, or there's no fulfillment of a rabbinical obligation by hearing Ha'azinu this week in the synagogue, unlike Zachor, which has to be then. Where does this come from? So the Vilna Gaon, in his commentary to Bar-Hayim, there when it talks about this, when the Shulchan Aruch brings this idea, says that the source is Megillah 18a. And there it talks about the reading of the Megillah itself, which is supposed to be a memorial, remembrance of what happened in the times of Purim. And there they derive that it means that in order to remember what happened Purim times, historically, you're supposed to write down the incident on a scroll, what we call a scroll vester, and it should be read publicly. And they learned this idea. The assumption is that this is learned from a connection with the idea of Zachor. What Amalek did should have been written down in a book and read. So therefore, it turns out that we do have sort of an obligation to read Zachor from Klaf. That is how we fulfill this rabbinic obligation. Now, it must be said that, I'll give a Maimonidean viewpoint on this one. There are a number of things where the commandment is Zachor. Let's take, for example, Shabbos. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat HaKadosho. It doesn't mean that there's a special Sabbath of the year whereon we take out a Sefer Torah and read that passage that says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat HaKadosho, and thereby fulfill our biblical obligation of remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy. How do we do that? The way to fulfill this biblical obligation, or this biblical commandment of Zachor with regards to the Sabbath day, is by, the sages told us to recite what we call the Kiddush on a cup of wine. And by the way, that's what we do for any Sabbath day, including Yom Tovim. When they begin, that's called the Kiddush, and when they end, that's called the Havdalah ceremony. So the sages know that there is a biblical obligation of Zachor, and the way to fulfill that according to their institution is by Kiddush. Zachor of Amalek is similar, and the way the sages ordained that we fulfill that particular commandment is not, let's say, by pouring a cup of wine and reciting a formula over it, but rather once a year taking out a Torah scroll and reading that particular passage. Okay? So the reading of Zachor is a rabbinical institution by through which we fulfill the biblical obligation. And you're going to say that, yes, this works also with the Zachor of Shabbos. Really, with regards to the Sabbath day, you could technically fulfill the basic biblical obligation of remembering the Sabbath day by just reciting something, Kiddush perhaps, a formula similar to Kiddush without the cup of wine if you're under duress. When does this happen? Those years where Yom Kippur, those years when Yom Kippur is also the Sabbath. It is there is no Kiddush on such a day. Even for someone who is ill and knows he will not be fasting, he does not take out a cup of wine at the start of what is both the Sabbath and Yom Kippur and recite a Kiddush thereon. Instead, he fulfills his biblical obligation of Kiddush by, for example, reciting his prayers. That's how he would do it. So technically speaking, one could fulfill the mitzvah of Zachor with regards to Amalek some other way, but the sages told us this is the way we should do it, the way they instituted. Another good example would just be Shema. One should read the chapters of Shema every day, morning and night. And the sages said that the way that they want you to do it is with the recitation of blessings before and after the Shema, what we have in our Siddur. That is the rabbinic way to fulfill the rabbinic way to fulfill the biblical commandment. And the same with Zachor. And I and others have said before that this shows that all the usual stringencies they apply to Zachor don't seem to have real meaning taken in this light. What does it matter? Why should anybody, for example, give extra special attention to how well he reads Zachor as opposed to any other Torah reading? They're all Torah readings ordained by the sages. Why is Zachor treated better? Some do say, and also I'll dispute this claim, some do say that because this one is a biblical obligation, one should throw in the Hidurim, should try to do it better than usually. That is a little bit difficult. There's a classic story, I forget who this was about, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, who obeyed the rabbinic dictum that when it comes to biblical obligations, we don't from the stringencies unless we're in a safek. If we're in a safek, did I fulfill the biblical obligation or not? That's a doubt. So do it. Perhaps again, if one did not recite his grace after meals is unsure, recite grace after meals. Perhaps do it again, perhaps just do it the first time, but do it if you're in doubt if you actually did it. With regards to rabbinical obligation, if he's already in doubt, so he doesn't have to. That is, yes, that's when we are more stringent with regard to biblical commandments. But with Stam, if a person has a biblical commandment to keep, he does not throw in all the stringencies. It's only when he has a rabbinical obligation does he throw in all the stringencies, because the rabbinical obligations require what Chazal said, a chizuk, a strengthening. The example I have from, I forget, it's in one of the Pnei Rav or Derech Rav, one of Rav Shechter's Sfarim about Rabbi Soloveitchik, talks about how when it was either Rav Chaim or Rav Moshe, so I have to remember this better. I'll go look this up afterwards. Perhaps one of you in listener land could tell me what exactly it was. There is, he waited the first night of Sukkot while it was raining. He didn't wait. He was with his new father-in-law. His father-in-law waited that first night of Sukkot for the rain to stop so he could finally go out to the Sukkah and say Kiddush and eat and do whatever he had to do, fulfill his obligation. And Rav Chaim or Rav Moshe just decided, no, not going to wait, and had Kiddush and had his meal, went to sleep indoors and didn't wait to go out to the Sukkah. And the eighth night, which in the land, in the diaspora, one should also fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah out of doubt. It's a biblical obligation then. It was again raining, but this time the tables were turned. It was Rav Chaim or Rav Moshe who waited up really late just to have his Kiddush and his meal in the Sukkah. But it was his father-in-law who did not wait. And his father-in-law questioned him about this. What's going on? Why did you, the first night, which was a biblical obligation, why were you lenient, whereas the last night, where it's a biblical rabbinic obligation, you were lenient? He said that's exactly the point. The biblical obligation, I was completely exempt. It was raining. That's it. What am I going to do? But the last night, when it's a rabbinical obligation, that needs strengthening. That's when we're more machmir to show. Unfortunately, a lot of people think, oh, it's just a derabanan. It's just a derabanan. It's just a rabbinical obligation. That's not the case. That's why the sage said you have to be extra stringent with your performance of rabbinical obligations. I don't understand why it is that people throw in, assuming Zachor is a biblical obligation. I don't understand why they throw in all these things. That's not the point of Zachor, that suddenly it's the Shabbos when we have, people want to learn a little bit of diktuk, or you read a word twice. I have written before, and I have a shir about this. I don't understand why it was that in the Mishnah Berurah we have the first thing that because he felt there was a suffix about the vowelization of a particular word, that would require reading that word twice. There's other cases in the Torah where there is an actual dispute about the vowelization, a dispute that actually makes a difference, and we don't tell people read both. We don't say ka'anakim, ka'anakim, vinikdash, vinikdash, which makes a difference. And there's cases where Segol and Serei are actually there. It's this week's Parsha, Yerachef and Yerachef. There isn't a machlokas there. That doesn't really make a difference, but there are other ones where it does. And for whatever reason, you go check out the video. I have an article about that. That didn't make much sense. But be that as it may, this is where it connects to this week's parsha. People have one of the stringencies with Zachor is, for whatever reason, and this I think is the dangerous thing, they say, well, a classical Ashkenazic, so-called Ashkenazic Sefer Torah is physically different than a Sephardic Sefer Torah. There's one word, the word daka, pitsuan daka, which refers to someone with a genital deformity. The question is the word daka written with a silent hey or silent aleph at the end. I like to say grammatically, with a silent aleph, it's a noun. It's a non-feminine noun. And if the word is written with a silent hey, it's a feminine adjective, the feminine of the word dak. Doesn't really make a difference. It's referring to the same deformity and the same halachic consequence. But that is a difference in how the Torah is written. The pronunciation doesn't really matter. The hey is silent, and everybody agrees that the vowel before it is a kametz. So there is such a machlokes. And some would say, well, that means that if it's not your traditional Sefer Torah, it means it's invalid for you because it has a letter wrong. A single letter wrong in the Sefer Torah invalidates it. They also say, well, a Sephardic guy says Shabbat, and an Ashkenazic guy would say Shabbos or Shabbos. So they pronounce things different. They have to have someone there pronouncing it right. Therefore, all you Goldbergs and Weinraubs and etc. have to get yourselves over to the Ashkenazic Young Israel for Zachor reading, and make sure that the fellow reading the Torah is a nice Ashkenazic Jew and reads it with pronounced the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet like the Samech, and he should also perhaps read it with the Ashkenazic tune, have Ashkenazic Torah. And all of you Sephardim, and Sephardim is anybody who's not Ashkenazic, by the way, have to use a Sephardic Sefer Torah and have one of your Sephardic Bali Kriya and read it like a good Sephardi, because that's what is necessary. Rabbi Avi Grossman actually wrote this, and he said that's lichatchila. That is the way it should be done. If it wasn't done, so someone still fulfilled his obligation. I would think that I haven't seen anybody who says someone has not, lichatchila and b'diavad, it has to be that way. Thank God. But I think that this is dangerous that you tell people to do this lichatchila, because it strikes at a very important principle in Judaism, and that is we are all equals and we can all discharge each other's obligations. To say that this Sephardic fellow cannot help me discharge my obligation or vice versa is striking at a fundamental principle behind achdut, Jewish unity. This cannot be. We are all equally obligated, and the sages never imagined that, for example, the Babylonians need to have their own synagogues, and as opposed to the ancient Israelis, because they do things differently. They certainly were pronouncing their Hebrew differently. That's known in the Talmud. They had different halachic practices. They had many things that were different. Those are also recorded in the Talmud. So you can't say, well, they do things differently, so they should do things. There should be a Babylonian synagogue somewhere in the Galilee, and there should be a Palestinian synagogue somewhere near Pumbedita for such a thing. Sages never imagined such a thing. That's a terrible thing. But more than that, we had the mitzvah of Hakel last week. Hakel is the commandment to actually read the Sefer Torah. Everybody must gather, including the women and the children, anybody in the converts, etc., even the slaves need to show up and be there for the Torah reading. And in the case of Hakel, the Torah reading itself is the commandment, unlike Zachor, and this is an important distinction. In Zachor, there is a biblical commandment to somehow remember Amalek, and the way to fulfill that biblical commandment, as ordained by the sages, is to have a Torah reading. But with regards to Hakel, the mitzvah actually is to read the Torah and have everybody listen to one person read the Torah. It's been pointed out by others that the fact that the Mishnah mentioned that it was done by the king and that was done in the courtyard of the temple is not critical. That means those are, once again, from the outset, lichatchila, those are meant to be done. But if they cannot be done, then we are still discharge our obligation. That's why there's a very good argument made by others already, hundreds of years ago, that at the end of every Shemitah year, the following Tabernacles festival, even if they get together with chief rabbis and the president, and they try to fulfill the mitzvah of Hakel in the Kotel Plaza, which is not on the Temple Mount, then they still are minimally fulfilling the basic biblical obligation to have Hakel. So the question I asked was, and I wrote about this, I said, wait a minute, if you're going to make all these claims about Zachor, that it should be with all these Hidurim, and that there's the Ashkenazic style of Zachor with the Ashkenazic Torah and the Ashkenazic person reading it, with the Ashkenazic tune and the Ashkenazic pronunciation and the Sephardic one, and of course, it's sort of racist to lump all non-Ashkenazim into one basket. They also should have, by the way, Yemenite ones and Persian ones, and don't forget our brothers, the Ethiopians. They have their own practices. If you were going to make this claim, so perhaps you should also have the Ashkenazic king read from an Ashkenazic Sefer Torah, Ashkenazic style for the Ashkenazim, and the king of the Sephardim should read from the Sephardic Sefer Torah, Sephardic style for all those Sephardim out there. Because l'chachila, that's the way it should be done. But this idea is actually quite extreme. I say it's absurd. I'm not making fun of it. I'm trying to say that that's a logical conclusion from this one. Ella, rather, you must say that we're all Jews and God does not want certain things like that. It's all kosher, and perhaps there's actually a healthy middle with regards to, for example, the way the tune is supposed to be, or the pronunciation. And indeed, now almost 14 years ago, I was involved in putting together a book, which is available for free online. We just mentioned it at the top of this session, and you could still get it, that most people who study these issues come to an objective, unanimous conclusion. Almost. There's only some fine points of pronunciation where people still disagree, but that is the way it's supposed to be done. And that's objective, at least according to our Masoretic tradition, which has been preserved for a few centuries and seems to be quite old. And I also pointed out that you could take the example of the Kohen Gadol. Perhaps because there are major critical differences between the classical Ashkenazic or the Proto-Ashkenazic medieval authorities and their Sephardic counterparts with regards to how the service on Yom Kippur was actually performed, and as the Mishnah points out there in Sotah, that just like the king has a public Torah reading on Sukkot, the Hakel, something similar to that was done on the day of Yom Kippur. And it says the Kohen Gadol would go out to the courtyard and read the Sefer Torah to everybody. So perhaps we need a Sephardic Kohen Gadol to perform the Yom Kippur service for all those Sephardim according to Sephardic Psak Halacha, and we'll have an Ashkenazic Kohen Gadol perform the Ashkenazic version of the Yom Kippur service for all those Ashkenazim, and we'll have a Yemenite Kohen Gadol also. As you may know, there were sometimes multiple Kohanim Gadolim, technically speaking, in the olden days, and this idea is also absurd, because the sages said very clearly, based on the Torah, that there's supposed to be just one serving high priest. And there's supposed to be just one temple, by the way. There's some people say, so we'll have a community, we'll build an Ashkenazic synagogue and a Sephardic synagogue, and if the other people get their act together, maybe we could have a Yemenite one too. I know of quite a few communities that have that arrangement. That is something that strikes at the heart of Judaism. We have to get beyond these things. There's not going to be 3 sections in the temple, or 4 sections as it may be. There's supposed to be but one temple. There's supposed to be but one altar. There's supposed to be but one person helping everybody fulfill, discharge everyone's obligation. There's no such thing as a Sephardic sounding of the shofar. There's no such thing as Sephardic prayer service as opposed to an Ashkenazic one. God doesn't care about that. He never did. And it's only when we get beyond these things will we be able to actually even begin to have a concept of what it means to have one unified temple. I don't believe that these things should be practiced in Zachor. I think it's highly divisive. I spoke about last week about ideal synagogues and also about selling seats. I don't think a synagogue should have these things anymore. I would think that, for example, when the Ramah lived in Poland, in Krakow, he basically set down a minhag, a practice, a ritual that included a lot of facets for the people who lived in Krakow. Do you think the people who lived in Krakow in the mid-1500s were homogeneous? They might have come from other places. There people who came from northern Germany and southern Germany and other places around Poland. They had practices that they brought with them, but they learned to homogenize. They didn't say, okay, so we're the ones who came from France originally. We're the descendants of French Jews. We're the descendants of German Jews. We're the descendants of Bulgarian Jews. They didn't do that. These things have happened before. It's only in this generation do we maintain these mechitzot, as they call them. We've been maintaining them for a few generations now. It's time that we get beyond it. Tonight, I actually prayed in a synagogue in Jerusalem. It reminded me of being in America. I haven't been to America in a long time, and I haven't been in such a synagogue in such a long time. But it was very surprising. I think that all the American Jews should, of course, pick up and come here. They have to get beyond what they're doing. They can't think of this place as this is a Jewish Disney World. They come here for holidays, etc., and then they go back. We need them here now. We need to change the system here. We need to have a better system of government. We need to have a different attitude toward Torah study and toward keeping the commandments. These are all critical for healthy Jewish living.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.